On September 12, 1683, on the hills above Vienna, King John III Sobieski of Poland stood with 18,000 cavalry behind him and made a decision that would determine whether Christian Europe survived or fell to Islamic conquest. Below him, 300,000 Ottoman soldiers were tearing apart Vienna's walls after 2 months of siege. Inside the city, 15,000 starving defenders were down to their last pounds of gunpowder, eating horses and rats to survive, dying of dysentery and plague at rates of hundreds per day. The Ottoman Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa had promised his sultan that Vienna would fall within weeks, that its population would be enslaved or executed, that the road to Rome itself would lie open. His army was the largest invasion force the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled, supported by massive siege artillery that had reduced Vienna's once impregnable walls to rubble. Every military calculation suggested the city would fall within days at most. But Sobieski looked at those 18,000 horsemen, including 3,000 of his elite Winged Hussars wearing eagle feathers that rose 15 feet above their armor, and decided to order the largest cavalry charge in human history. What happened in the next 4 hours would break the Ottoman Empire's power forever and create a legend so powerful that Europe still celebrates it 3 centuries later. To understand the absolute desperation of Vienna's situation, you must understand what the Ottoman Empire represented in 1683. This was not a declining power. This was the superpower that had conquered Constantinople itself in 1453, that controlled territory from Algeria to Iraq, that fielded armies larger than any Christian nation could match. Under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1500s, Ottoman forces had reached the gates of Vienna once before and nearly taken it. Now, under Sultan Mehmed IV and his ambitious Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, the Ottomans were determined to finish what they had started. The invasion force that marched on Vienna in summer 1683 numbered roughly 300,000 soldiers, though some contemporary sources claim even higher. This included 60,000 elite janissaries, the Sultan's slave soldiers taken as children from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained as the most disciplined infantry in the world. It included massive cavalry forces of Sipahi warriors, descendants of the mounted archers who had conquered Byzantium. It included irregular troops like the Tatars, and the terrifying Delhi cavalry known as the Mad Ones, who wore animal skins and lion manes into battle. And it included the largest siege train ever assembled by the Ottomans, with massive bronze cannons capable of reducing stone walls to powder. The march to Vienna was itself a campaign of terror, designed to break Christian resistance before the siege even began. As the Ottoman army advanced through Hungary in June and July 1683, they systematically destroyed every town and village in their path. Contemporary accounts describe entire regions being depopulated, with tens of thousands of civilians enslaved and marched back to Ottoman territory in chains. At Perchtoldsdorf, just south of Vienna, the garrison surrendered after receiving promises of mercy. Kara Mustafa had them all executed anyway, roughly 3,000 men, women and children, and had their bodies displayed as a warning to Vienna. The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. When refugees poured into Vienna describing Ottoman atrocities, panic spread through the city. Many wealthy families fled, taking their wealth and leaving the defense to the poor and the soldiers. By mid-July, when the Ottomans arrived and began surrounding Vienna's walls, the city had roughly 15,000 defenders, including 5,000 professional soldiers, under the command of Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg. They faced an enemy 20 times their number with the largest siege guns in the world pointed at their walls. Every rational calculation said they should surrender immediately. But Starhemberg had studied Ottoman siege tactics and knew that surrender meant death regardless of any promises. So he prepared Vienna for what he knew would be a fight to extinction. The city's walls were medieval fortifications, strong but designed for an earlier era of warfare. The Ottomans had perfected siege warfare over centuries of conquest. They didn't just bombard walls. They combined artillery with aggressive mining operations, digging tunnels under fortifications and collapsing them with explosives. Within days of the siege beginning in mid-July, Ottoman engineers were tunneling toward Vienna's walls while massive bronze cannons fired day and night. The psychological impact of continuous bombardment was devastating. Defenders couldn't sleep, couldn't rest, lived in constant terror of walls collapsing on them. The Ottomans focused their assault on specific weak points, particularly the Lobelbastei and Burgbastei, pounding them with concentrated fire while miners worked underground. By early August, sections of Vienna's walls had been reduced to rubble. The Ottomans assaulted the breaches repeatedly, sending waves of janissaries armed with muskets, swords, and hand grenades made from clay pots, filled with gunpowder and metal fragments. The fighting in these breaches was horrific, hand-to-hand combat in confined spaces where men used bayonets, axes, and even rocks when ammunition ran out. Inside Vienna, conditions deteriorated with terrifying speed. The city had stockpiled food for a siege, but not for 300,000 enemies and not for 2 months. By late August, the garrison was on starvation rations. Soldiers were eating horses, then dogs, then rats. Dysentery spread through the crowded city as sanitation systems broke down. Contemporary accounts describe streets filled with corpses that couldn't be buried because there wasn't enough manpower to dig graves while also defending walls. The smell of death and disease became overwhelming. Worse, plague broke out in the cramped conditions. Hundreds were dying daily from disease alone, not counting combat casualties. The defenders' gunpowder supplies were running critically low. By early September, Starhemberg was rationing ammunition so carefully that musketeers were ordered to fire only when they had clear shots at Ottoman officers. The situation had become mathematically impossible. Even if every defender killed 10 attackers, the Ottomans would still vastly outnumber them. Messages were smuggled out of the city begging for relief, but no one knew if help would come in time. Starhemberg calculated they had perhaps 1 week left, maybe 2 at absolute most, before the walls collapsed completely or starvation forced surrender. He prepared his men for a final suicidal counterattack when the end came, determined to die fighting rather than face Ottoman execution or slavery. But unknown to both the defenders and the Ottomans, a relief force was assembling with unprecedented speed. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had fled Vienna when the Ottomans approached, a decision that earned him lasting contempt, but he had immediately begun coordinating a relief effort. This required something almost miraculous in 17th century European politics, getting Catholic and Protestant states to cooperate against a common enemy. The response was remarkable. German princes contributed troops. The imperial army marched from multiple directions. Most crucially, King John III Sobieski of Poland received desperate pleas for help and made a decision that would define his legacy. Poland and the Holy Roman Empire had been rivals, even enemies at times. Sobieski had no obligation to risk Polish lives for Vienna, but he understood that if Vienna fell, Poland would be next on the Ottoman target list. More than that, Sobieski was a brilliant military commander who had spent his entire life fighting Ottomans and Tatars. He had defeated Ottoman forces at the Battle of Khotan in 1673, where he commanded cavalry charges that broke larger enemy armies. He knew Ottoman tactics intimately, and he believed he could win. So Sobieski gathered his forces and marched toward Vienna at remarkable speed, covering ground that should have taken weeks in just days, through forced marches that exhausted his men, but got them to the battlefield before Vienna fell. By early September, the relief force had assembled in the hills northwest of Vienna. The combined Christian army numbered approximately 70 to 75,000 men, with Sobieski commanding roughly 27,000 Poles, including his elite cavalry. The rest included imperial troops under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, German contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia, and smaller forces from various states. Sobieski, as the highest-ranking monarch present, took supreme command despite technically being in someone else's territory. He immediately climbed the Kahlenberg heights overlooking Vienna, and Vienna's situation was desperate beyond imagination. Ottoman siege works had completely encircled the city. Sections of wall had collapsed into rubble. Constant smoke from bombardment obscured details, but it was obvious the city was on the edge of total collapse. Kara Mustafa's massive tent city stretched for miles, organized with Ottoman precision, his personal compound alone housing thousands. The Ottoman army was so confident of victory that they hadn't properly fortified their camp or positioned reserves to defend against relief forces. This was the critical Ottoman mistake. Kara Mustafa had become obsessed with taking Vienna quickly to prove his genius to the Sultan. He had concentrated all his forces on the siege, assuming no relief force could arrive in time or would be large enough to matter. He had left his armies back completely exposed. Sobieski spent September 11th positioning his forces on the heights above Vienna. His plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Rather than a cautious approach or attempting to cut Ottoman supply lines, he would attack directly down the mountainside with the full weight of his cavalry in one overwhelming charge. The terrain was terrible for cavalry, wooded hills that would break formations. But Sobieski believed that if he could get his horsemen through the woods and onto the plain before Vienna, the psychological impact of 18,000 cavalry appearing at full charge would shatter Ottoman cohesion. He positioned the Imperial and German infantry to attack the Ottoman left flank, tying down janissaries and preventing them from repositioning. The cavalry, including his precious Winged Hussars, would form the right wing and deliver the killing blow. The Winged Hussars were unlike any military unit in Europe. These were Poland's elite heavy cavalry, noblemen who could afford the enormously expensive equipment required. Each hussar wore a steel breastplate and helmet, carried a long lance, multiple pistols, a saber, and most distinctively, wore wooden frames on their backs from which 15-foot-tall eagle feathers rose, creating a towering appearance that made them look supernatural. The sound of thousands of these feathers rustling as they charged was described as like thunder mixed with the roar of demons. They were trained to charge in tight formation at speeds that seemed impossible for heavy cavalry, using the copia lance technique where the rider held an 18-foot lance tucked under the arm, absorbing the impact with their entire body when it struck. September 12, 1683, began with a pre-dawn mass held by Marco d'Aviano, an Italian priest who had accompanied the relief force. Sobieski reportedly told him, "I came, I saw, God conquered," echoing Julius Caesar, but attributing victory to divine intervention. At first light, the Christian forces began their advance. The Imperial and German infantry engaged the Ottoman left flank immediately, drawing thousands of janissaries into brutal close-quarters combat. The janissaries were elite soldiers, disciplined and well-equipped with muskets and bayonets, but they were being pulled out of position by the infantry assault. This was exactly what Sobieski needed. Throughout the morning and early afternoon, his cavalry descended through the wooded hills in column formations, struggling through terrain that should have been impassable for mounted troops. Ottoman observers could see movement in the woods but couldn't determine numbers or intentions. By early afternoon, the vanguard of Polish cavalry emerged from the tree line onto the plains before Vienna. Behind them, more cavalry kept emerging, squadron after squadron, forming up in parade ground precision despite the difficult descent. The Ottoman camp began to realize they were facing not a raid, but a full cavalry army. Kara Mustafa ordered Sipahi cavalry to intercept, sending roughly 10 to 15,000 horsemen to meet the Polish threat. The two cavalry forces clashed in a series of running battles across the plain, traditional cavalry tactics of charge and countercharge, pistol fire, and saber combat. The Ottomans were experienced, skilled warriors, but they were fighting uphill against heavier cavalry, and most critically, they were facing the Winged Hussars. At approximately 5 p.m. on September 12, 1683, King John III Sobieski personally led the final charge. Behind him were 18,000 cavalry spread across a 3-mile front, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history by number of horsemen. At the center, wearing their distinctive wing frames and feathers, were 3,000 Winged Hussars, the most elite cavalry in Europe. Many of them personally loyal to Sobieski, men who had followed him through decades of warfare. The order came, and 18,000 horsemen began to move. First at a walk, maintaining perfect formation, lances lowered into attack position. Then trot, the ground beginning to shake from the impact of 72,000 hooves. Then canter, formation still holding despite the speed. Then finally, full gallop, 18,000 cavalry at top speed. A wall of horseflesh and steel 3 miles wide thundering across the plain toward the Ottoman camp. The sound was described by survivors as like continuous thunder, mixed with the rustling roar of the hussars' wings. A sound so loud that it could be heard inside besieged Vienna, miles away. Ottoman defenders tried to form infantry squares, the traditional defense against cavalry, but they were already disorganized from the day-long fighting, their formations incomplete, their flanks exposed. The Polish cavalry hit the Ottoman positions like a tsunami of steel and horseflesh. The Winged Hussars struck first at the center, their 18-foot lances impaling Ottoman soldiers 3 and 4 at a time, the impact of armored horses at full speed, simply bowling over anyone in their path. Lances shattered on impact, and the Hussars immediately drew sabers and pistols, continuing to cut through Ottoman ranks in wedge formations designed to split enemy units apart. The Ottoman army disintegrated with shocking speed. Veteran janissaries who had never retreated in their lives broke and ran within minutes of the cavalry impact. The Sipahi cavalry that had been fighting all afternoon simply couldn't stand against the weight and momentum of the Polish charge. Entire regiments dissolved into panicked mobs fleeing back toward their camp. What had been an organized army of 300,000 men became a desperate stampede of individuals trying to save themselves. The Polish and Allied cavalry pursued ruthlessly, cutting down fleeing Ottomans from behind, a tactic considered dishonorable in European warfare, but absolutely standard in Eastern European conflicts. The slaughter continued for miles as Ottoman units that hadn't even seen the charge caught the panic from fleeing comrades and joined the retreat. Kara Mustafa tried desperately to rally his forces, but the psychological shock was too complete. His soldiers had spent 2 months slowly grinding down Vienna's walls, convinced of inevitable victory, focused entirely on the siege. The sudden appearance of 18,000 cavalry charging from the hills had shattered their confidence instantly. Within hours, the Ottoman camp was being overrun. The Imperial and German infantry, seeing the cavalry breakthrough, pressed their assault with renewed energy, pushing deep into Ottoman positions. By nightfall, the Ottoman army was in full retreat, abandoning their siege works, their artillery, their supplies, everything in their desperate flight to escape the cavalry pursuit. The casualty figures tell the story of complete Ottoman catastrophe. Contemporary estimates suggest 15,000 to 20,000 Ottomans were killed in the battle and pursuit, though exact numbers are impossible to determine given the chaos. For comparison, Christian casualties were roughly 2,000 to 3,000 killed and wounded, an almost absurd ratio that speaks to the devastating effectiveness of the cavalry charge. But the real losses for the Ottomans weren't just the dead, they were strategic. The entire siege train was captured, including dozens of massive bronze cannons that the Ottomans had spent decades manufacturing. Supply dumps with months' worth of food and ammunition fell to Christian forces. Kara Mustafa's personal treasure, the gold and jewels he had brought to distribute as rewards after Vienna's conquest, was captured by Polish forces, instantly making many hussars wealthy beyond their dreams. Most devastating of all, the psychological impact shattered Ottoman confidence. This had been the largest invasion force in Ottoman history, led by the Grand Vizier personally, aimed at conquering Vienna and opening the road to Western Europe. Its complete defeat in a single afternoon of cavalry charges fundamentally changed Ottoman strategic calculations. The empire would never again attempt to conquer Vienna, would never again pose an existential threat to Central Europe, would begin the long, slow decline that would eventually destroy it. Inside Vienna, the moment the battle turned became obvious when Ottoman bombardment suddenly ceased and sounds of distant battle changed to sounds of Ottoman panic. Starhemberg, who had been preparing for a final suicidal defense, instead ordered his garrison to sally forth from the gates and attack the Ottoman siege works from inside, while the relief force attacked from outside. Vienna's starving, diseased, exhausted defenders found reserves of energy they didn't know they had, and fell upon Ottoman positions with desperate fury. They had suffered 2 months of hell, had watched hundreds die daily from starvation and disease, had been pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. Now they had a chance for revenge, and they took it. The Ottoman units trapped between Vienna's walls and the advancing Christian army were annihilated. Many surrendered, but many were simply killed by defenders who had no mercy left after months of siege. By September 13th, Vienna was completely relieved, the siege was over, and the Ottoman army was scattered across Hungary in full retreat. Sobieski entered Vienna as a hero, greeted by crowds who literally kissed his feet. He sent a letter to his wife stating, "We came, we saw, God conquered," and wrote to the Pope describing the victory as a gift to Christianity. His reputation reached legendary status across Europe. The Winged Hussars became the most celebrated military unit of their era, their charge at Vienna mythologized in paintings, poems, and eventually films centuries later. But the aftermath reveals the darker complexities of this supposedly clean Christian victory. The Ottomans retreated through Hungary, but Christian forces pursued them with orders to give no quarter. The pursuit became a massacre that lasted weeks, with Christian cavalry hunting down fleeing Ottomans and killing them by the thousands. Villages that had submitted to Ottoman rule during the invasion were punished with mass executions, their populations accused of collaboration. Tatar irregulars who had fought for the Ottomans were hunted specifically, their camps surrounded and destroyed, women and children killed alongside the warriors. European commanders justified these atrocities as revenge for Ottoman depredations during the invasion, but the reality was straightforward ethnic and religious massacre. Tens of thousands died in the pursuit and its aftermath, numbers that rivaled the battle casualties. Christian propaganda at the time portrayed the victory as purely defensive, saving Europe from Islamic conquest. But modern historians note that the Holy Roman Empire immediately used the victory as justification for aggressive expansion into Ottoman-held Hungary and the Balkans, beginning wars of conquest that would continue for decades. The Battle of Vienna wasn't just a defensive victory, it was the beginning of a new phase of Christian imperial expansion, eastward. For Kara Mustafa, the defeat was literally fatal. Ottoman culture demanded success from military commanders, and failure at this scale was unforgivable. He retreated to Belgrade with the remnants of his army and attempted to reorganize for another campaign, but Sultan Mehmed IV sent a messenger with a silk cord in December 1683. This was the Ottoman method of executing failed officials, death by strangulation performed by mute executioners to prevent any final words. Kara Mustafa was strangled to death, and his body displayed as a warning. His head was sent to the Sultan preserved in honey as proof of execution. The Grand Vizier, who had promised to conquer Vienna and deliver Europe to Islam, died in disgrace, blamed personally for the disaster despite the impossibility of defending against 18,000 cavalry charging from high ground. His fall was politically convenient for the Sultan, who could claim the defeat was due to one man's incompetence rather than systemic Ottoman military decline. But informed observers recognized the truth. The Ottoman military system, which had conquered Constantinople and threatened Europe for centuries, had been decisively defeated by a tactical innovation, concentrated heavy cavalry used in overwhelming mass charges that the Ottomans had no counter for. Their janissaries, trained for siege warfare and infantry combat, were helpless against charging armored horsemen. Their Sipahi cavalry, excellent in skirmishing and harassment, couldn't match European heavy cavalry in direct charges. The defeat at Vienna revealed fundamental weaknesses in Ottoman military organization. The legend of the Winged Hussars that emerged from Vienna grew beyond all historical proportion. Within decades, Polish cavalry were portrayed as supernatural warriors, blessed by God, invincible in battle. The distinctive wing frames and feathers were mythologized as having mystical properties, creating sounds that drove enemies mad with fear, making hussars appear as angels or demons depending on whose side they fought for. These legends ignored crucial realities. The hussars were elite heavy cavalry who succeeded at Vienna primarily due to excellent timing, favorable terrain, and Ottoman unpreparedness. They were superb warriors, yes, but not supernatural. At other battles where conditions weren't perfect, hussars had been defeated. At Clushino in 1610, Polish hussars had won spectacular victories against Russians. But at Berestechko in 1651, hussars had been bogged down in swampy terrain and suffered heavy casualties. The wings themselves, while psychologically impressive, were primarily ceremonial, worn only by wealthy elite warriors who could afford them. Many hussars at Vienna didn't wear wings at all, wearing standard cavalry armor instead. But legend doesn't care about such details. The image of the winged hussars became permanently embedded in European consciousness as the ultimate cavalry, the warriors who saved Western civilization from Islamic conquest, an image that persists in popular culture today, despite being more mythology than history. The strategic consequences of Vienna rippled across Europe and the Ottoman Empire for decades. For Poland, the victory represented the last moment of true greatness before terminal decline. King Jan III. Sobieski had saved Vienna and become Europe's hero, But Poland itself was surrounded by powerful enemies and would be partitioned out of existence within a century. The financial cost of maintaining elite cavalry forces like the Winged Hussars was bankrupting the Polish nobility, who insisted on maintaining private armies rather than funding a modern national military. Within 50 years, Polish hussars would be obsolete, unable to compete against modern infantry armed with bayonets and efficient musket drill. The last true Winged Hussar units were disbanded in the 1770s, right before Poland ceased to exist as an independent nation. For the Holy Roman Empire, Vienna's salvation began the reconquest of Hungary and the Balkans from Ottoman control, wars that would continue until 1699's Treaty of Karlowitz, where the Ottomans ceded massive territories. For the Ottoman Empire, Vienna marked the beginning of 3 centuries of decline, from superpower to sick man of Europe, to eventual collapse after World War I. The empire would win battles and even wars after 1683, but it would never again pose an existential threat to Europe, never again expand significantly, would spend the next 200 years slowly losing territory to European and Russian conquest. The brutal irony of Vienna's salvation is that the city celebrated for decades while ignoring the human cost. The official narrative was heroic. Christian Europe united to defeat Islamic invasion. Elite cavalry saved civilization. God blessed the righteous with victory. The reality was significantly darker. 20,000 men died in the battle, most of them conscripted peasants on both sides who had no choice about fighting, who were killed or wounded fighting for causes they barely understood in a war between empires they didn't belong to. Inside Vienna, thousands had died of starvation and disease during the siege, their bodies buried in mass graves that were conveniently forgotten in the victory celebrations. The pursuit after the battle had killed tens of thousands more, with Christian cavalry massacring Ottoman stragglers and hunting down anyone suspected of collaborating. Villages throughout Hungary were destroyed, their populations killed or enslaved by both sides at various points in the conflict. The total death toll from the Vienna campaign, including siege, battle, and aftermath, probably exceeded 50,000, possibly much higher. These deaths were rarely mentioned in the heroic accounts. Polish hussars became legendary, but the thousands of German infantry who died fighting janissaries in brutal close combat were forgotten. King Sobieski was celebrated as savior of Europe, but the Emperor Leopold, who had fled Vienna in panic and left his people to die, was quietly rehabilitated once victory was secure. History, as always, was written by the survivors. The final assessment of Vienna must balance legend against reality. Was it a crucial turning point in European history? Yes, absolutely. If Vienna had fallen, Ottoman forces would have had an open road through Austria toward German states, potentially changing European development fundamentally. Was it a David versus Goliath victory of outnumbered heroes defeating overwhelming odds? Not exactly. The relief force of 75,000 wasn't much smaller than the estimated 100,000 Ottoman soldiers who were actually combat effective at the battle itself. Many Ottoman troops were tied down in siege operations and couldn't respond to the cavalry charge. The battle was won primarily through superior cavalry tactics and Ottoman unpreparedness, not through miraculous heroism. Were the Winged Hussars supernatural warriors who single-handedly saved Europe? No, they were elite heavy cavalry who performed exactly as their training and equipment designed them to perform, charging in mass formation and breaking enemy lines, supported by 18,000 other cavalry, and tens of thousands of infantry doing the brutal work of pinning Ottoman forces in place. But here's what's undeniably true. 18,000 cavalry charging in formation down a mountainside and across a plain, smashing into an army 20 times their size and routing it completely, was one of the most spectacular military achievements in history. The Winged Hussars, whatever mythology surrounds them, were genuinely elite warriors who performed magnificently at the crucial moment. And King John III Sobieski made the bold, aggressive tactical decision to charge directly into a vastly larger enemy army and won completely. A victory that genuinely did stop Ottoman expansion and change European history. The legend may be exaggerated, but the core truth remains. On September 12, 1683, 18,000 cavalry broke 300,000 men and saved Vienna from certain destruction.